So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Elida Bautista. I'm the Director of Inclusion and Diversity. I work at Haskell of Business as the Director of Inclusion and Diversity across our degree programs, and I've been working, partnering with Alumni Relations and Haas Digital to do this series. This is our third installment in our DEI series for alumni, lifelong learning. So my understanding is that I know we had a short kind of turnaround for this particular session, so not everybody would have had the chance potentially to access the pre-work, the lectures, and the homework. So we encourage you after this session to go back. There's maybe 3 or 4 mini lectures, like 5 minutes each, with some homeworks or pre-works, individual work to do as part of that. And so I'll be referring to the worksheet that's used in the pre-work a little bit, but just want to do a really quick overview. The different modules that we've done are implicit bias. So this is, when you have negative associations toward somebody in a particular social identity group that are held unknowingly. So you're not aware that you have this negative association until it's expressed automatically. We covered privilege in those previous sessions. So this is when you have unearned advantages in society that are granted to you solely based on your membership to a particular identity group. We also covered microaggressions. And so these are, whether they're intentional or unintentional, they're these kind of casual degradations of somebody from a socially marginalized group based solely on that identity, right? So that it's a comment that snubs a member of a particular group for being a part of that group, that reinforces that social hierarchy of belonging. And today we're working on allyship, right? So the premise being that having an understanding of our own implicit biases, of where we might have privileged identities, and how those manifest into microaggressions are essential in our understanding of how to show up as an ally, so that we know what it is that we're trying to address or interrupt, and where we have advantages that somebody else might not have, to be able to speak up, and how do we empower those folks to be in the room, to be able to have a voice. So wanted to give you the opportunity for a little bit of Q&A before I do the overview of allyship. For any of the folks that did do the homework or the previous session, was there anything on your mind specifically around allyship? We covered characteristics of an ally, the action continuum, and the action planning sheet. So I'm referring mostly to the action, the characteristics of an ally and the action continuum. So anybody have any questions, you can either unmute yourself or drop it into the chat. And I'll just start with a quick overview. So I'm going to share my screen. This is all in the Canvas module. Excuse me. So the primary thing that we highlighted in the module was having an understanding that allyship is on a continuum. It's something that you'll need to continue to show up and work on. It's not a one-time thing. It's not a permanent identity, right? And that even as an ally, there might be times that you stumble in trying to, as you learn and continue to grow as an ally. But essentially, the concept is that you recognize where you have some privileges and leverage those to be an agent of change rather than an agent of oppression. And the few things that I would highlight for our session today that are that you can reference in the Canvas in more depth are that foundational to this is to have some self-awareness around your own cultural identity, and having comfort and pride in what that cultural identity is rooted in, so that it doesn't become an aspect of shame per se, or that your identity is defined by having privilege, if that makes sense. And that, a lot of the work is going to be to listen and learn, right? Where you have opportunities to engage with others from different identities that you're trying to be an ally for. that part of the work is acknowledging that we have privilege and that we have some humility around not knowing everything, right? And so I encourage folks to, do their own learning, since that was one of the ones that came up in our poll around, listening to podcasts or viewing documentaries, reading, whether it's academic reading or articles or whatever it might be, posts. I highly recommend following people on social media, whether it's Twitter or Instagram or something along these lines. There's a lot of accounts that you can casually follow as a way of learning and getting to know somebody from a different identity group and how they think and things that they're faced with. That is a way of not burdening somebody who's an individual in your own social circle, right? So that there's a lot that you can glean from those interactions in a way that's almost like you have a lot of folks in your sphere, even if you don't personally have a lot of connections. So that's where I would just, those are some of the highlights there. And then, and I guess the other thing that I think is worth mentioning here is that when you take action as an ally, that it's important to recognize that we benefit from that as much as the group that we're working with and being an ally for. There's a Fannie Lou Hamer, I think, quote. I shouldn't try to quote anybody directly without having the reference, but essentially the gist of it is like that none of us are free until all of us are free, right? And so that working towards social justice and showing up as an ally is as much a benefit for us as it is for everybody. It is in our self-interest, also because when somebody has that level of acceptance and belonging, they can fully show up as themselves, and we all benefit from that talent, that wisdom, just everything that somebody from that community can bring to society as a whole, right? So I'll leave it at that. I encourage you to go to the Canvas to learn more. The action continuum is what our poll was based on today. And that is just recognizing that our journey in allyship is not static. It's not a one-stop. It's not only it doesn't only look one way. So it's not just marching on the streets with protest signs, and it's not, yelling at your neighbor or engaging in some, back and forth on social media per se, right? Like for all of us, we're going to start somewhere. And unfortunately, the first is that you might not know that you're actually participating in the oppression of others by perpetuating stereotypes, for example, right? And so I point this one out because often we think, oh, that's those people over there, right? I'm not one of those folks. They're actively participating in telling derogatory jokes or something like that. But just to recognize that while we might not be intentional in participating in that way, when we lack awareness, right, we might unintentionally be perpetuating stereotypes or discrimination against individuals from a historically marginalized group. Recognizing no action was one of the ones that came up in the poll, that a lot of folks are in this stage. And so what we're talking about here is that you see something, but you might not interact, or you might not intervene because you're not sure of what the right thing to say is, or you might feel like it's not in your place, or maybe it feels unsafe for some reason. And then the other two that came up pretty high were educating self and educating others. And the one thing I would say here is that as we educate ourselves, to kind of hold that, like, remember that you started somewhere on this journey when you encounter somebody who is at a different place, right? And so that in educating others, we maintain some of that confidence without attitude, right? That you can engage in a curious way, share a resource, kind of ask like, well, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like, what's behind that comment? Or Is your thought that XYZ, right? So that in educating others, it's not about shutting them down or shaming them, because chances are we were probably over here on the continuum with another identity group and we're just not aware of it. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and come back to our Q&A and see if there is any questions that have come up either from this little synopsis or from the pre-work. Kevin, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we do have a question from Jackie, and she specifically asks, she asked the group in general, but also to you, are there any specific social media accounts that you would recommend to follow?
Yeah, I welcome the group to chime in here. Are there any social media accounts that you find yourself learning from? Whether it's somebody on Twitter that you follow or Instagram. I follow Conscious Kid. I love Conscious Kid. Michelle Kim, yes, Michelle is one of our alums and she posts quite a bit on LinkedIn in particular. So she's somebody that you can follow on LinkedIn. And I would add from Black Lives Matter, Patrice, I'm kind of blank on her last name, but she's pretty active on, I follow her on Instagram. She pretty much daily will post these little videos, or maybe she posts like a summary video each week of a variety of social causes and actions that are coming up on a full range. So anything from, you know, ICE and immigration policies to, you know, school funding to a variety of things. So LGBTQ. All right, I encourage you to continue to add, thank you, Patrice Colors, to add to the list on the group chat. Kevin, do we have another question?
And there's one, and this comes from Paroma, actually, one of my classmates. How's it going, Paroma? So what I'm gonna do is I'll forward this exact question straight to Elida, and perhaps Elida can follow up with you about that. But other than that, just keep the social media recommendations coming in. And also, just as a plug, we are running an alumni like Slack workspace with a diversity channel on it. I will follow up with everyone on this webinar and also those who did register and sort of just share that out so you guys can join, continue the conversation. And Elida is actually very active in there and has her own voice happening on that channel. So thank you, everyone.
And I encourage everybody else to also add to that channel in particular on our Slack. We have a couple other alums who have been posting some really great resources. So definitely join the Slack and let's continue the conversation there. If there aren't any other questions right now, what we're going to do is we're going to break up into groups, small groups of 4. I'm going to encourage you to, you know, kind of keep in mind our typical community standards of, you know, listening respectfully, listening for learning, speaking from your own voice, and that, you know, taking away the learnings, but not sharing out specific details of somebody's story that they might share. So we're going to do a couple of things. I'm going to encourage you to, when you're in your groups, to be off mic and actively engage with each other. So there'll be groups of 4. And in this small breakout group, we're going to start with 2 things, which is in the pre-work, there was an action planning sheet. So whether you did it or not, it's okay. But in the pre-work, the action planning sheet was asking you to reflect on what are some actions that you want to take to interrupt or combat an ism, and what are the resources that you have, as well as the obstacles that you anticipate. So in this small group, you're going to identify, and we'll put this into the broadcast as well. Identify an action that you can take in your sphere of influence, starting with yourself, and then stage 2, close family and friends. So one example of starting with self could be, I'm going to commit to listening to a podcast episode once a week to learn about stereotypes and stigma as a whole, right? So hidden brain might be one that I would recommend. So that can be a commitment that I take for myself. An action that I am going to commit to taking with close family or friends might be to invite a close friend or family to watch a documentary together, or once I've listened to an episode of a podcast, I might share it with a particular family member so that they can also increase their learning. So I'm going to encourage you to each identify an action and also have a conversation about what barriers do you anticipate? Is there some discomfort given that educating others, the understanding no action was kind of high on the list for some people. What's getting in the way? Is it discomfort? Is it I don't know how to bring it up? Is it I don't want them to think I'm a certain way? It doesn't feel appropriate. So having a conversation of what are those anticipated barriers for you to take one action within your immediate sphere of influence. So right now we're only talking about self and close family and friends. We'll talk about school and community in the next round. So I'm going to ask Fernando to help us out and put us into small groups, and I will type in the instructions again and the broadcast. Welcome back, everybody. We didn't lose folks. I've been in other times where, because it's tricky between the two options of like leave meeting versus leave group. I accidentally left the meeting. But yeah, thanks everybody. So wanted to just open up and see if anybody wanted to share out anything that came up in their group, whether it was an insight or a particular question, before we do the second round. And the second round of group breakouts will be briefer. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to either share with the group or ask that something that came up in your group chat?
This is Maylee. I'm
Hi,
number 19. So in our group, we have someone who is very deeply involved in DEI. And she gave me some advice because I dealt with a little situation with someone in my cohort who's Asian American and grew up in China and recently posted something that was challenging to respond to because some of the content included All Lives Matter and included like, why are we doing this? Like, we should be focusing on the environment. And how she helped me to connect how to engage Asian Americans into the dialogue, because I think that it's a different culture and not understanding the history of the US completely and some of the roots and growing up here and the things that you see and experience weren't quite there. And so I think that's where the gap is. And so I just, just got some ideas on how to connect her and bridge a little bit.
Thank you.
She's my cohort buddy.
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity to leverage your relationship to engage in a conversation and kind of highlight where there might be those gaps or bring some understanding. And maybe even having some understanding of who are those groups that she grew up with, right, that might be historically marginalized and maybe using that as a way of understanding. I think about people with disabilities, the world over, LGBTQ, right, that there are, other minority groups. And I mean, certainly in China now, we're hearing a lot about the Uyghur population. So I'd say the other thing is that I often hear this either or dichotomy. And as somebody who's like my like environmental concerns have been a compass for me throughout my life since I was a young adolescent, and just how I was raised by my parents. It's just worth noting that the negative impacts of all sorts of environmental issues disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities in the U.S. and in the global South. And so everything from exploiting the land to water access to, in the U.S., there's just been a long history of freeways being cut through low-income Black and Brown communities that then result in air pollution, you know, and then you get all of the health disparities that go with that, cancer, asthma, etc. So it's all interconnected. And so if the driving issue is environmental, then it might be a different entry point in helping understand why this is all interconnected. It's not an either or. Anything else that came up in your small group that you'd like to bring to the larger group, an insight that you might have had, or something that you'd like to share about a barrier or, that you anticipate and that you got some support on? We have Michelle K.
Yeah, what I struggle with, and I know it just takes practice, but when confronting people, if I hear something that I feel very uncomfortable with, is learning how to do it in a way that shows, you know, more curiosity and openness rather than condemnation. Because as soon as someone starts getting defensive and hostile, they shut down and can't hear anything. It's fight or flight.
Right, absolutely. And that's true for us as well, right? If we're triggered by a comment. So I would encourage you to have just a regular practice of anything that's grounding or self-regulating, so that in the moment you're observing your own physiological response to somebody who makes a comment, or you know, whatever it is that you might be responding to. Maybe you read something that's like, oh, you know, that cringe, and it's like having that self-awareness and what it is that you might need in that moment to be able to engage. And so, you know, sometimes it might be that you need a minute, right, before you can engage with curiosity. And it's about circling back. To folks who have more practice, they can just take that deep breath and be like, you know, and buy themselves a pause, so that yes, you definitely don't want to create a defensiveness, because then the conversation is done, right? That physiological response intervenes with them being able to engage, you know, with their frontal lobe in a conversation with you. And so, you know, it could be that you practice with somebody, it could be that you consult, like Maylee just shared, right? And then you circle back and say, you know, I've been thinking about that thing you said. You know, I'm curious, where did you get this idea that XYZ? Or is what you were trying to say blah, blah, blah? I'm not sure if you meant to say it that way, because how that comes across to me is, right? And so in the course, tell me again what it's called, Kevin. The platform.
Canvas?
In the Canvas, thank you. In the Canvas, we have a worksheet on the microaggressions module that has some kind of prompts, so that you have an understanding of why is a certain comment or whatever it might be considered a microaggression, but then it gives you some language that you can use as a way of engaging in that curious way, even potentially by saying, did you know that, you know, when you say XYZ, you know, like when you tell somebody that their English is really good, you know, and they're fourth generation Japanese, it's like, how's that different from you who's like fourth generation Swedish or whatever it might be, right? So just kind of pointing out those subtle ways in which, like, you know, that there's no reason for you to be surprised that their English is good. It's like they're American. Or, you know, you can use humor. I would say that's one that works for a lot of folks, is just kind of gently teasing, or depending on what your rapport is and what that relationship and setting is. Anybody else struggle with that, or have other ways that they have engaged successfully in not creating some defensiveness?
Just a comment, Alita, it's Laurie here. I find I get emotional reactions to certain things. If it's with friends, like sometimes I'll get emotional, like I'll cry about stuff, which can be kind of awkward and embarrassing, but it's not something I can actually control. And if it's with people that I trust, it's okay. But in other situations, you know, it's not going to be good for me or good for them. Like I have to be with someone who's supportive and who understands and so forth. I also feel, you know, sometimes I get upset and angry, and then my communication shuts down, etc. So I'm starting to think a little bit more about, if I can put it this way, protecting myself a little bit from toxic or unhelpful engagements with people. And then with friends, I think it's more about how we build understanding. I know for myself, for example, I have some tension around what I would see as you know, political correctness or something in a certain way, and authenticity. Like, I think we're censoring ourselves sometimes. There's some things that I find that are funny, or I think that are not offensive, that other people might find offensive. And I find that whole thing around offense a very, very difficult issue. It's a very, very challenging issue. And like, for me, it's more about, do I have the best intentions for people, or am I trying to hurt people? I try and look at it from that perspective, because I think there's a thing around misunderstanding or gaps or whatever, whether it's about history or whether it's about people's perspective. And there's a certain education that comes with some of these things. And then there's a deliberate choice to be hurtful. So I know the context, I know the thing. It's like the fellow in Arizona who had the mask on and made the quote joke about "I can't breathe." I mean, that was offensive. That was cruel. That was very deliberate and targeted. You know, there's no excuse for that. You know, and so I'm trying to internally, how do I differentiate those things? And if I've caused offence, well, one, do I even know it? I have a friend who's from Africa. He made a comment the other day that he goes through his life often where he extends his lips as opposed to smiling. So it's how he presents himself in a day, with the weariness or the baggage and the stuff that's going on, and how he disguises emotions to kind of just get through a day. And it was a bit of an insight there. So that's like something for me. That was a lesson for me about, I can now ask him, are you smiling or are you extending your lips? You know, that's my way of sort of reading about, am I okay in what I'm saying? Are you comfortable with what I'm saying or not? You know, how do I do better? But it's a really challenging area, and I think there's a risk. Personally, I feel a risk that by trying not to commit some kind of offence or aggression, microaggression, whatever you want to call those things, there's also a consequence around, are we censoring ourselves? Are we becoming less authentic? Are we holding certain things in? And how do we manage that tension?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that the thing to consider is, you know, there's certainly the intention, which is about, it's, as you said, you know, it's different if your intention is to harm, right? But sometimes even the unintentional causes harm, right? And so as part of the allyship continuum, part of the educating self and those characteristics is being open to feedback, right? Is being open to listening. And so it's not about censoring yourself. It's about, okay, I have this feedback, and now what do I do with that? The next time, am I going to make the same comment, having had this understanding that lands offensively, right? But also it's about having an understanding of, I care about this person and they're probably getting the same comment on a daily basis for their whole life, right? And so what might feel humorous to one person at some point feels exhausting to the other. And in this, when I think about like interpersonal racism and institutional racism, that's the connection, right? That as we let certain things slide, it starts to dehumanize somebody or to perpetuate stereotypes in a way that then allows for, you know, different practices that are discriminatory. And so one example I'll share with you is that pretty much anytime I've been out in a social setting at a bar or even a Haas alumni gathering or whatever it might be, somebody will ask me where I'm from. And at times those conversations are really just genuine interest of connection, right? And I usually say Chicago. I'm very proud of being from Chicago. It's like anybody else makes a Chicago reference and I'm like, Chi-town, you know, it's like, it's a thing. It really informs who I am, you know, the generation I grew up with, what shaped me. My parents are from a region of Mexico that, you know, I spent summers in. I was raised with a pretty strong indigenous identity. If somebody asks me where I'm from Chicago, right? And that's not typically what they really want to know about me, but then they challenge it, but like, no, where are you really from? And I'm like, I really am from there. I was born and raised there. And so that underlying question becomes, you don't belong here, right? You can't possibly be American because you're brown, right? Or because your name is a Spanish surname. And so when you get that on a daily basis, it becomes like a reinforcement of the stereotype of anybody that has a Spanish surname must be a foreigner. And then it allows for policies around discrimination around immigration status, or, you know, and that's been going throughout in the US, throughout the history of the Southwest, since it was previously Mexico, and the conditions of that treaty were that any of the Mexican citizens were going to become US citizens. They were allowed to have, you know, access to everything in Spanish and could retain their land, which all got undone. But since then, there's a cycle of like every 20 years, you know, some major push to exclude that population, and in a variety of ways, whether that's public education or whether that's deportations, even of US citizens that are of Mexican descent. And so it's this long history, right? So then when somebody asks me where I'm from, it feels like a huge loaded thing, right? And so it's just important to know, like, you're not the first person to ask me, right? This is something I get on a daily basis that then signals this whole history that I'm aware of about my people and how we've been pushed out or excluded. And especially when people say, but you don't look American. And I'm like, Americans look like me before they look like anybody else. Like, we are an indigenous people. And so those you know, contradictions are not always apparent, because now what people think of as American, even when I travel abroad, is somebody who's, especially if I say I'm from California. Now I'm from California, right? I'm no longer from Chicago. So when I travel, I say I'm from California. You know, their idea is a blonde surfer, right? You don't fit this idea that I have of what a Californian looks like, even though 40% of the population in California is Latinx, right? So does that answer your question about like kind of intention,
Yeah.
the slippery slope? And it's not about censoring yourself. It's really about, okay, now that I've learned this, what do I do with that information? And how do I respond automatically? And what do I intentionally then continue to do or not do?
Yeah, look, it does, and it helps that. And I think part of it is how I interact with friends as opposed to how I interact with people in a more general setting. Because
Right.
I think with friendship, you know, that whole feedback mechanism works, right? And I ask, and I really expect, I oblige my friends to give me that honest feedback.
Yeah.
And I do the same, even though sometimes that's painful, or awkward, or whatever it is. But it's how you grow. But you know, I appreciate that. And what I find, I get weird stuff on where am I from as well. I got asked if I was from Mexico just the other day, and then I laughed and I said 2 words and I said, "Oh, Australia." And you know, but people are trying to put you in boxes, right? I mean, people are trying to.
They're trying to connect. They're trying to understand. Yeah. And I think, yeah, it's totally different with friends, right? I can tease or joke or whatnot, and it's a different way of interacting, and there might be more permission giving, right? Because we have something that's foundational. But if a stranger comes up to me at a bar and asks me that and won't take Chicago for an answer, I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't need to engage with you. I got enough people in my life.
Yeah, I agree.
Anyway,
Absolutely.
on that note, let's take another
quick.
quick little. Oh, thank you, Laurie. Let's take another quick little small group breakout. We will this time only do, let's say, 10 minutes. And the different thing that we're doing this time is identifying an action that you can take in your sphere of influence, going beyond yourself and your family. This time, we're going to go into your workplace or school setting, any service organizations that you're part of, you sit on a board, or community, right? So if you're, you know, in a PTA or, you know, any kind of leadership position in your community. So I'll give a couple examples. So in my work org, service, whatever it might be, there are people that I interact with on a regular basis. So I'm probably not a good example for this because this is my job. So I would say an example that you might use is that you can join an ERG in your company as an ally. Or maybe you can, if there's somebody that you work with in your team or in another team that you are familiar with, that you might decide to sponsor them, right? Like if you're in an organization where women only make up 20% of the population, then, you know, you might, you know, reach out to a woman and offer coffee or something like that and kind of explore what their career path is, etc. In the community, you might, even if you don't have children, maybe you listen in to a school board meeting, or maybe you attend a city council meeting and listen to what are those concerns that are coming up from the community. Speak up and advocate if it's an area that you have particular expertise in. So there are ways that you can engage. So we're going to do a quick breakout group, and that'll be, Fernando will put us in groups of 4 again, for about, let's say 8 minutes. So
you guys should all see a little window pop up where if you just click join, you can jump in your live set or your breakout rooms now.
welcome back, everybody. So we do have a second poll that we're going to do, very similar to the first. I meant to do it earlier. I know we're reaching the end, but I just kind of want you to reflect on the same questions with a different umbrella group. So we started at the beginning with a poll around race, and this time we are doing the same poll, but regarding the LGBTQ+ community. Okay, thank you everybody for responding. It seems like for this one, most folks fell on the recognizing and no action, whereas in the previous poll we had more folks in the educating self realm. So I would encourage you to think about, we're kind of toward the end of Pride Month right now, that there will be still quite a bit of activity in the next couple days. This is the 50th anniversary of Pride in San Francisco, and I think that might be the case in LA as well, and a few other spots. And so there's a lot of programming online this weekend. I encourage you to think about in intersectional ways the disproportionate impact, for example, on trans women of color and how they've been treated in terms of rights and in terms of violence in this country, and I imagine across the globe. So there's an opportunity to continue to educate yourself, to see and understand where there's overlap, and potentially learn as you get to see and experience a variety of people that fall under this umbrella, that it might give you ways to, when you recognize, be able to take action, right? To be able to point somebody to a resource, or even shifting terminology, right? So those sorts of things. So I know at times doing this work is work. And so at times it might feel like I'm tired or it's overwhelming, but I just encourage you to take that opportunity to be a student always. And again, not to see this as an either or, but rather an interconnected part of the work as an ally. Okay, any final thoughts in terms of what came up in your group? Any debrief or kind of final questions in the last few minutes of our session today? Did anybody identify a community or social action that they can take in their sphere of influence?
We had a question, so maybe you could help us with this. It was in the final closing seconds. There were a couple of people who said, yes, I want to be able to share. I'm not necessarily the lead of that team. I'm a member of the team. What can I do to share? And that's when the clock went off. So can you give us some top tips?
In terms of if somebody is a leader of a team,
you're not a leader of a team, but you want to be able to spark a conversation with your group. What do you do?
Yeah. Maybe you reach out to the leader of the group and ask them if you can have, 5 or 10 minutes on the agenda to introduce the possibility of like, who's interested in doing this book club with me, or who's interested in, having lunch together where we can kind of brainstorm ideas about how we can support XYZ group, right? And so that you get a sense of who among your colleagues has energy for this or curiosity about it, and maybe they invite, friends that they might have in other groups, right? Additionally, as you see things come across your desk and your sphere of influence, anticipating who isn't represented in this group, right? And how might our actions and decisions in this group impact somebody from that community, right? So that if, I'll share an example. We just did a podcast yesterday, and that is another channel for you to kind of get to know more folks in a variety of different experiences. But we interviewed an alum, and this should be, I think, probably going live today, Stacy Jackson. And he shared a story with us about how when he transitioned, he was able to have his name changed in his diploma and in a variety of ways, but somehow that didn't quite make it to either his undergrad or to Haas. And so he was receiving correspondence with his former name. And it was a real trigger for him of like, I've gone through all these processes to get my name changed, and Haas won't recognize this, right? And so, potentially there's this opportunity for somebody to figure out how are these systems interconnected? And if I know to change this name in a diploma, if I work in this office, how do I alert my colleagues in other offices so that, at UCSF, we had a similar issue where it was, considered a security thing, where suddenly everybody's email got defaulted to use your name that was on your birth certificate and on your state ID, which for any trans employees was suddenly, they were being outed without their knowledge or permission overnight. And so, I don't expect you to be able to hold everybody on the forefront of your mind, but there are these tweaks that we might not even think about, but it's just an opportunity to slow down and say, okay, who's not at this table? And if we do X, who can be impacted, and how might we invite that voice? Can we have lunch with somebody? Can we have a little focus group? Like, to what extent can we slow this down to even just reflect what is going on here, where we have an opportunity to do something different? So I don't know if that, I invite others who might have tried, to kind of have some leadership or voice when you don't have an official leadership role in your team. Any practices that you've engaged in that you want to share? I think another way that you might do this is by starting to be an ally to a group that already exists, right? Maybe you start attending some of those speaker series or functions or whatnot, and that's information that you might take back and inform your role, right? Oh, there's this thing coming up. I heard that as we're engaging in our mid-year evaluation feedback, folks are experiencing this item in a certain way, right? How are we thinking about it as a company, right? And so you might, if you have a privileged identity that allows you to ask the questions that might feel more threatening for somebody from a marginalized group to ask those questions, that's the opportunity. And even if you don't quite get it, you might even say that, right? Like, I'm not from that group, so I'm not really sure what the thing is, but maybe we can bring them in, right? To make sure that we're understanding that correctly. That might be a way to kind of get through the discomfort, have the disclaimer up front, right? Any other questions that came up, or insights in your group, or actions that that you identified in terms of your sphere of influence that you might want to share with others as examples?
I think one thing that came up in our group was mentoring, and taking the opportunity to mentor someone that does not look like you. I gave the example of the fact that I'm an African American male, but I work in an environment where it's mostly it's financial services, so it's dominated by white males. But I mentor a lot of young white males just to give them a different cultural perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And for people within my own, my own ethnic group will say, well, why are you mentoring these young white males when there's lots of inner city young, needy African American males that need mentoring? And my answer is always, white males need mentoring as well. And if we leave young white males to be mentored by old white males, nothing will ever change because they're not going to learn anything new. So, and I found that very rewarding. And you have an opportunity to mold a young mind in a way that they're still going to have their white male privilege, but
Mm-hmm.
they're going to look at the world in a different way for having known me and my extended family and my friends, and really including them in your life. And that's a way to forge friendships with people that are not that don't look like you. In one of the earlier sessions, we had people that were talking about the fact that they don't have all of their friends look like them, and how do you change that? That's one way you can do it. You can mentor someone and just bring them into your life.
Yeah, absolutely. When I reflect back, when people ask me, kind of how did I turn out the way I did, is as a young child, all my teachers were of different ethnicities, and I had a lot of Black teachers in elementary school. My college mentor was African American. He was the first one to pull me in to do research. And that continued, through grad school. And then I, in turn, have mentored a lot of Black and Latina women in particular, but also white males who were really interested in working with underserved community when I was working at San Francisco General. And that was just as important to make sure that there wasn't harm being caused if they were going to be providing mental health services to Black and brown families. And so I agree. I think it's those are all opportunities to form relationships and have those different foundations. And I hope you all had that experience today, even in these small breakout sessions, just getting to know your fellow Hasis from different years and different degree programs and locations, but also that we all come in different packages. So I want to thank you for taking the time today, and I encourage you to visit the Canvas. There's a lot of resources on there. There's more in-depth explanations than what I provided today that I hope augment your learning. I put one of the links in the box that is Your Black Friends Are Busy. It's if you click on that link, it's a pretty rich resource. I don't know if it came through to the whole, yeah. Your www.yourblackfriendsarebusy.com. It's a pretty rich resource of readings and podcasts, and so right now, if what's on your radar and you want to have a better understanding and how to have a commitment, in particular to the Black community, given the level of violence and and the disparities that have existed for centuries, really, but are coming to light now. For a lot of folks, this is new to them. This is one resource where you can start with your own learning, so that, again, folks are tired and emotionally exhausted. And so it helps to come informed if you have a relationship with somebody that you've already at least taken those first steps in making an effort to have some understanding and knowledge yourself. So thank you all, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.